Good morning. Earlier, the Secretary General just left Geneva, and he's on his way back to New York as we speak. Earlier today, he delivered remarks, as you know, to the opening session of the 58th session of the Human Rights Council. He began by recalling that today's session was held under the weight of a grim milestone, the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in violation of the Charter of the United Nations. The Secretary General reiterated his call to the international community to spare no efforts to bring an end to this conflict and to achieve a just and lasting peace in line with the Charter, the international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Turning to the work of the Security Council, the Secretary General said that without respect for human rights, sustainable peace is a pipe dream. Human rights are the oxygen of humanity, he added, but one by one they are being suffocated. As the recently adopted Pact for the Future reminds us, the Secretary General added, human rights are in fact a source of solutions by advancing human rights through development, through climate action, through stronger and better governance of technology, and through the recognition that the rule of law and human rights go hand in hand. For his part, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, warned that decades of human rights progress are currently under strain. He called on everyone to act to make sure that human rights remain foundational to our societies and our world, adding that to be effective, they require leadership from the heart, rooted in facts, the law, and compassion. This afternoon, the Secretary General also spoke to a high-level meeting on the Conference on Disarmament. He reiterated that the nuclear option is not an option at all, and reminded participants that in the Pact of the Future, member states recommitted to nuclear disarmament and the final objective of complete disarmament. His remarks were shared with you throughout the day. The Secretary General also had a number of bilateral meetings. Further to what he said on Ukraine in Geneva, as you know, over the weekend, the Secretary General also issued a statement in which he affirmed that the war in Ukraine stands as a grave threat not only to peace and security in Europe, but also to the very foundations and core principles of these United Nations. After 3 years of death and destruction, he once again calls for an urgent de-escalation and an immediate end to hostilities. The Secretary General welcomes all efforts towards achieving a just and inclusive peace, and the UN stands ready to support such efforts. As you know, at 3 p.m., the Security Council will convene for a meeting on Ukraine. Well, first consultations and then an open meeting during which they will hear a briefing from Rosemary DiCarlo, our Undersecretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs. I have a statement to share with you on Sudan. The Secretary General is deeply concerned at the announcement by the Rapid Support Forces and affiliated civilian actors and armed groups of a political charter that expresses an intention to establish a governing authority in Rapid Support Forces areas of control. This further escalation of the conflict in Sudan deepens the fragmentation of the country and risks further entrenching the crisis. Preserving Sudan's unity, preserving Sudan's sovereignty and its territorial integrity remain key for sustainable resolution of this conflict and the long-term stability of Sudan and the wider region. The Secretary General also condemns the persistent violence perpetrated against civilians across the Sudan by both parties to the conflict, including ethnically motivated attacks. Sudanese women, Sudanese children, and men are paying the heaviest price for the continued military offensives by the belligerents in this conflict. The Secretary General's personal envoy, Ramtam Lamamra, is engaging by the warring parties and all other relevant stakeholders to achieve progress on a cessation of hostilities, protection of civilians, and humanitarian access, and to promote de-escalation. That statement is being shared with you, and just more granularity on the suffering that the Sudanese people are subject to. The ongoing hostilities, insecurity, and attacks on healthcare facilities in Sudan continue to increase the risks of disease outbreaks across the country. Our humanitarian colleagues say that the cases of cholera in White Nile State are rising. According to health authorities, over 1,600 cases, including 63 deaths, have been recorded in recent days. Yesterday alone, 289 cases, including 5 deaths, were reported. A likely source of the infection is the White Nile River, where families have been collecting water during major power outage following drone attacks on power plants. On 21st February, the Sudanese Ministry of Health and the World Health Organization, as well as UNICEF, launched a 6-day cholera vaccination campaign in the localities of Kosti and Rabak in White Nile. They aim to reach more than 1 million people with oral cholera vaccines. Since the start of this cholera outbreak in July of last year, more than 55,000 cases of cholera, including nearly 1,500 deaths, have been reported from 12 out of Sudan's 18 states. That's what local authorities and our health partners are telling us. We reiterate our appeal for all sides to adhere to international humanitarian law and ensure that civilians and critical civilian infrastructure be protected and never be targeted. Our Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed is in Nairobi, Kenya, in preparation for the second Food Systems Summit stock taking. She's meeting with member states as well as representatives from the private sector, youth, and civil society to bring out the progress, challenges, and opportunities needed to ensure the July stocktake is action-oriented, driving food system transportation and securing global food security. As part of her visit, she toured the Food for Education Giga Kitchen, which is the largest kitchen in Africa that's run independently and locally. It provides over 63,000 students with meals daily from a single kitchen and over 500,000 across all its kitchens in Nairobi. This organization has scaled up from feeding 10,000 children per day 2 years ago to 500,000 children per day today. She also visited the UN office in Nairobi, where she met with the UN country team to discuss how to strengthen our impact in Kenya and deliver more effectively on the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've been asked about the Secretary General's reaction to the situation in the West Bank, in addition to what he said today in Geneva. I can tell you that the Secretary General is alarmed by the escalating violence, attacks and large-scale Israeli security forces operations in the West Bank's northern governorates, including the deployment of Israeli tanks for the first time in over 2 decades. He's deeply concerned by the increasing number of fatalities, including children, and the mounting number of displaced Palestinians and a broadening scope of civilian infrastructure destruction. He's appalled that children continue to be victims of violence. These attacks and mounting violence must end. He urges the security forces to exercise maximum restraint and use intentional lethal force only when strictly unavoidable to protect life. He firmly rejects statements by Israeli officials indicating the intention to remain in some northern occupied West Bank area for extended period and to refuse the return of displaced Palestinians to their homes. He calls on Israel to comply with its relevant obligations under international law and international humanitarian law as applicable, and to take measures to protect civilians and ensure their safety. Turning just a bit more on the northern occupied West Bank from our colleagues at OCHA, who warned that the ongoing operations are having severe humanitarian consequences. Yesterday, military tanks and additional forces were deployed by Israeli security forces to Jenin, reportedly with orders to prevent residents from returning. On Friday, a 13-year-old girl was shot and killed near the camp. In Kabatia city in Jenin Governorate, residents have been ordered not to leave their homes, while bulldozers have raised roads, leading to electricity blackouts for some 40% of the population. Tens of thousands of Palestinians remain unable to return home, requiring large-scale humanitarian assistance in their current temporary locations. In Gaza, we have an update for you on the polio vaccination campaign, which started Saturday. By the second day of the campaign, we reached more than 450,000 children under the age of 10. This is more than 3/4 of the targeted population. Day 3 of the campaign is currently ongoing. Since the onset of the ceasefire and as of yesterday, We and our humanitarian partners have provided tents to families across Gaza, mostly in the north. Our partners are also distributing ceiling material and tarpaulins to support those living in damaged buildings. Our partners are also working on food security. Tell us that the number of bakeries operating throughout Gaza by the World Food Program has risen to 5 before the ceasefire to 25 as of today. Additionally, 780,000 hot meals are being distributed daily. Since last month, our humanitarian partners have screened over 80,000 children aged 6 to 59 months for malnutrition, admitting those in need for appropriate treatment. And just last week, we distributed hygiene kits to nearly 8,000 households and water jerry cans to about 3,500 families. OCHA stresses that sustaining these scaled-up humanitarian operations require both generous funding and, of course, for the ceasefire to hold up. And Jean-Pierre Lacroix, our head of Undersecretary General for Peace Operations, wrapped up his visit to Sudan, Abyei in South Sudan today. In South Sudan, he met with President Salva Kiir earlier today, wrapping up his visit and speaking to the media. He said that the primary purpose of his visit was to reaffirm the UN's continued support and commitment to South Sudan, particularly as the country enters the fourth extension of its transitional period in the face of dire economic and humanitarian situation, as well as rising violence. Mr. Lacroix expressed hope that the parties to the revitalized peace agreement will overcome political deadlocks throughout consensus and move swiftly to ensure that this latest extension leads to elections under best possible circumstances. We, of course, stand ready to assist. Over the weekend, he visited Abyei, where he met with local and international stakeholders, including the Sudan and South Sudan appointed administrations, traditional leaders, civil societies, women's groups, and, of course, UN agency and our own peacekeepers. Discussions focused on the UN mission's protection efforts in Abyei and the proliferation of arms and escalating humanitarian crisis driven by Sudan and the conflict in Sudan and the floods in South Sudan. In Port Sudan, he met with the Minister of Defense of Sudan, with high-level officials of the Sovereignty Council and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and UN agencies. From Juba, he will head to Delhi to attend the 2025 Women, Peace and Security Conference. And turning to Haiti, I can tell you that the Secretary General is deeply saddened by the death of a Kenyan a Kenyan police officer that occurred yesterday, serving under the multinational security support mission in Haiti. The officer was apparently injured during an anti-gang operation and subsequently succumbed to his injuries. The Secretary General extends his condolences to the family of the police officers, the people and government of Kenya, and of course all of his colleagues in the MSS. Turning to the situation in the DR Congo, on the humanitarian front, the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says it's deeply concerned by this surge of crime and insecurity, which has led to ongoing civilian casualties in the east, including the death of humanitarian workers and widespread human rights violations, as we've been telling you. In Lubero territory, north of Goma, clashes last week forced more than 100,000 people, that's about half of them children, to flee their homes. Several local health facilities had to suspend activities. Our partners, who also report there have been widespread human rights violations during clashes, including rape. In Goma, our partners report rising crime in recent days, including home invasions and kidnapping, in some cases leading to deaths. Several humanitarian organizations have reported attempts to seize their vehicles. Our partners are also reporting a similar increase in crime and insecurity in South Kivu, where there's been an uptick in home invasions and killings, notably in the city of Bukavu. In the city of Uvira, also in South Kivu, local sources report that multiple incidents of violence, rape, and looting in recent days. In North Kivu, a humanitarian aid worker was hit by a stray bullet during clashes on the 20th of February near a hospital in Masisi territory, about 80 kilometers west of Goma. He died from his injuries on Saturday, bringing to 6 the number of humanitarian workers killed in eastern Congo since January of this year. The same clashes reportedly killed 3 other civilians and injured a child. OCHA calls on all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And on the peacekeeping front, our peacekeepers tell us that the security situation in North and South Kivu remains unstable and highly unpredictable in the territory seized by the M23, which reports of further advances by the group towards the town of Lubero. Colleagues tell us that the peacekeeping mission's ability to deliver on its mandate continues to be significantly restricted in M23-controlled areas in North Kivu. However, the mission continues to provide protection to thousands of people who sought refuge within its various bases while seeking ways to ensure their safe transfer out of Goma. And of this morning, the mission facilitated the medical evacuation of 19 soldiers from the Southern African Development Community mission in the country from Goma. And staying in East Africa, in Mozambique, the deputy head of Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the World Food Programme are a joint visit to Mozambique to press for continued global support for Mozambicans. The conflict and increasingly frequent and extreme weather events are driving humanitarian needs to unprecedented levels in the country. Joyce Masuya, the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Carl Scow, the Deputy Executive Director of WFP, are meeting with government officials, affected communities, donors, representatives from the international and regional financial institutions. They will discuss how to continue to collaborate to find practical ways to up our humanitarian assistance. Mozambique, as you know, is facing overlapping crises with some 5 million people, that's nearly 1 in 7 across Mozambique, in need of urgent humanitarian assistance to cope with the effects of cyclones, of conflict, and of drought. And lastly, our colleagues at the Office for the Human Rights in Geneva today released a report urging the Colombian government to protect civilians during the ongoing violence by armed groups. The report, which covers 2024, details how armed groups use violence to exert control over population, furthering their own economic interests and undermining governance. The situation disproportionately impacts indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant communities, as well as peasants. The UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk said the escalation of fighting in Catatumbo region since mid-January, where more than 52 people were killed and tens of thousands forcibly displaced, highlights the ongoing suffering caught in the midst of violence and armed conflict. Deji.
What does the Secretary General have to say on the results of the 6 votes today in the General Assembly?
I mean, we'll leave it to journalists and analysts to comment. I mean, for this was a decision of the General Assembly. I think the Secretary General's own position on the conflict in Ukraine, I mean, was stated over the weekend, was stated again on Monday. Obviously, I think whenever there's a resolution of the General Assembly, it's an important step in that body exercising its mandate.
Right. On Gaza, we know that Israel halted the release of Palestinian detainees, which might lead to another hurdle of the ceasefire deal. Does the Secretary General have anything to say on that?
Look, we're very concerned about the situation regarding the ceasefire and its precarious state. What we want to see is the full implementation of what was agreed to by the parties, the dignified release of all the remaining hostages, including the bodies of people who'd been held hostage, and irreversible progress towards a two-state solution, and even more, obviously, humanitarian aid coming in. And I wanted to add that Sigrid Kaag will be here to brief the Security Council tomorrow in person, and we expect her to be available too at the stakeout. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Ming Lu from China Daily. So the adopted resolution this morning, we do see it had fewer supports, votes in favor than previous ones. Does the UN feel this as a weakening of global support for Ukraine, or are there other factors at play?
Look, again, I think that's a question best answered by journalists and commentators. We're not here to comment on the different the different level of support for each resolution. It was adopted. Who voted for, who voted against, who abstained is clear to all. It was done in an open manner and in a recorded vote.
I'm sorry, another question.
Yeah, of course.
So there have been discussions that Trump is trying to weakening the China and the Russian relations, and just hours ago, Xi Jinping and Putin had spoke with each other and reconfirmed their close ties. So how does the UN feel this shifting dynamics, and do you see any impact on efforts to resolve the Ukraine conflict?
Look, we are seeing a lot of things shift, right, in the past few weeks. What we want to see is obviously increased and more positive global cooperation, especially by major players, so we speak, and members, permanent members of the Security Council, and we want to see a reaffirmation by all member states of the principles of the Charter and the ideals of the Charter that they all signed on to. Mr. Avni.
Two questions on two different topics. The first was, if there's a Security Council resolution that is contrary to a General Assembly resolution and comes after a General Assembly vote, does that have any effect over the validity of the General Assembly resolution?
I try not to speak about legal issues I'm not fully versed on, and I especially try not to speak about legal issues that are hypothetical, on which I'm not fully versed on.
Well, it's
no, I understand. I mean, I think let's see what happens in the Security Council.
Okay, second question. I just don't understand what you're saying about the northern Palestinian, occupied Palestinian territory. If it is occupied, then what is new about tanks getting in there? Isn't that part of occupation?
I think what we're seeing is a level of military operations that we haven't seen in quite some time. We're seeing a destruction of civilian infrastructure at a level that we haven't seen in quite some time, and we're seeing displacement of Palestinians that we haven't seen in quite some time.
But is it, according to the view that this is an occupied territory, is that an intensifying situation of the occupation, or is that just something completely out of the blue?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Benny.
My question is, occupiers occupy.
Right, but it doesn't. Let's.
Let me cut through the chase a little bit. Obviously, Jenin and that whole area of the northern West Bank has been no-go, not only for Israel but also for the Palestinian Authority for a long time. So, is that a change now? So was it occupied before, even though it was a no-go zone?
Well, it was. Listen, let's cut to the chase, right? In my answer, I think there are security operations that have to take place anywhere in the world against. But it does not mean that we accept the use of warlike tactics, that we accept the use of tens of thousands of people being displaced or civilian infrastructure like roads being cut up.
What do you mean warlike tactics?
But
I raised on Friday the issue of a bus bombing that came from the northern West Bank.
I think we've been very clear, Benny, in condemning acts of terrorism. Tony.
Shukran, Steph. The U.S. today, twice, before and after the vote, reiterated that the UN must stop the killing. I'll quote, "We urge all member states to join us in returning the UN to its core mission of international peace and security." Any comment, sir?
Look, When people talk about the UN, I think the question you need to ask them, which part of the UN are you talking about? Are you addressing member states or are you addressing the Secretary General? I can't answer for the 192 other member states. I can answer for the Secretary General, and I think what he has been calling for since day one is an end to this conflict in line with the Charter of the United Nations, in line with international law, in line with General Assembly resolution and the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. The Secretary General, I think, for one, has been extremely consistent in his message.
But allow me a follow-up. Like, why would the United States mention that it requires or it's asking for a returning of the UN to its core mission? A returning. This language is very...
Tony, there is, in front of this podium, there is a seal. It's not the U.S. eagle. It is a seal of the United Nations. I can't answer a question that says, why did the United States do this? Or why did France do this? Or why did Monaco do this? Please. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. My question is on the new EU sanctions. The European Union has banned 8 Russian media outlets from broadcasting in Europe. Russian officials said that this violates international norms of freedom of the press. So what is the UN's comment on this?
Look, I haven't seen the specific sanctions. What I can tell you is that we firmly stand for freedom of the press and for people to have as many views as possible, access to as many views as possible. Deji.
Sorry, let me get you back to the voting this morning. According to the statement released by Secretary General on the occasion of the 3rd anniversary of the Ukrainian crisis, Secretary General still used the word, I quote, full-scale invasion. Today, Russia, US both voted against this term, full-scale invasion. China abstained. In what occasion might the Secretary General think of walk back from the full-scale invasion, or he would stay that way?
The Secretary General will stay consistent on his messaging in what he wants to see.
So there's no way that he is going to walk back.
The Secretary General has been very consistent on his messaging, and I think you know him, he's not about to change. Thank you. Any questions online? Okay. Thank you all.